I'm just going to jump right in. Chad mentioned I'm going to talk about wheat diseases today. Most of you probably know me, but I'm Carl Bradley, extension plant pathologist. I work on soybean and small grain diseases here in Princeton, although I do work across the state, but I'm located here in Princeton. So I want to cover 4 different diseases that I think are of importance so far this year at least, and you can see all 4 of those listed there. I'll just go ahead and talk about each one individually. First one I wanted to talk about is bacterial leaf streak. I am seeing this a little bit in some varieties this year here in Princeton. I've had some people send me pictures. Of course, it's always difficult to give 100% diagnosis via a picture, but there are certainly some things that have come in my email box that looks like it could be bacterial leaf streak. One of the things that makes this disease important is that it could easily be confused with some of the fungal leaf blotches. And so obviously with this being a bacterial disease, fungicides are not going to work to control this disease. So if you are seeing leaf symptoms out there and decide to spray a fungicide and those symptoms continue to advance, it could potentially be bacterial leaf streak. One of the ways to maybe help differentiate bacterial leaf streak from some of the fungal leaf blotches is that the pathogen starts to basically exude bacterial cells out of the lesion that you see on the leaves, and those will dry on the surface of the leaf, and it will give the leaf a little bit of a shiny appearance. And here's a picture of some bacterial leaf streak. You might be, if you can see my cursor on here, this area here, you can kind of see how that's a little bit shiny. I have a picture I took yesterday from some trials here in Princeton, and I think this captures a little bit better where you can see that shininess on that leaf where it almost glimmers because of those bacterial exudates. So that is something that I am seeing out there, and I know maybe some of you have seen it as well, maybe have even sent me some emails about it. This same pathogen can cause a black chaff of wheat as well, where we see some of the discoloration on the head there. So potentially whenever you have bacterial leaf streak on the flag leaf, you have a higher risk of getting black chaff. Not really any management that you can do for this season, but for next season, if you are seeing it, it is important to choose varieties that are going to be less susceptible. But I think most importantly is don't plant BeRun Seed. This can be a seed-borne pathogen. And if you are continuing to plant BeRun Seed, you're probably going to end up running into an issue with this disease, as well as some of the smut diseases that we see as well. I'm seeing some leaf blotch out there as well. There's a couple of different pathogens that cause leaf blotch in our area, and they both look the same basically. They're hard to differentiate, but one's Septoria, the other Staganospora. The Staganospora fungus also causes gloom blotch, and we've had issues with gloom blotch in the past as well, so you're probably familiar with that disease. In regards to being able to tell the difference between these diseases and bacterial leaf streak, you know, with the shiny appearance that I just showed you with the bacterial leaf streak, you won't see that with the leaf blotch diseases. We may see a more defined lesion. We may see black dots within the lesion. Those are called pycnidia. That's a sign of the fungus. Just a couple of pictures here. And I may not be accurate, but I think the one on the left is probably Staganospora and the one on the right is probably Septoria. From a management perspective, they're basically the same, so you don't really have to worry about identifying these in the field. You can sort of lump both of them. But you can tell that these seem to have a little bit more defined lesions. You can see the lesion. There's a specific area. And you may see on the picture on the right there some of those fungal signs, those pycnidia, those black dots that are going to form within those lesions. So if you see that, you do know that that is a fungal disease, either Septoria or Staganospora. As far as management, we do have good resistance to these diseases in some varieties. Some may be susceptible. So picking a variety with a good level of resistance is important. Fungicides are also pretty important. Some of those first fungicides that you might apply, right at jointing or so, those might help slow down this disease. It may not prevent it completely later on if you have a very susceptible variety, but these diseases tend to start at the bottom canopy, and then as we get more rain, it splashes spores up the next leaf and so on and so on. And so we want to try to prevent this disease from getting to the flag leaf. Once it gets to the flag leaf and causes lesions on the flag leaf, we may see some yield loss. So fungicides are effective. There is a caveat, is that we are, thanks to some funding from the Kentucky Small Grain Growers Association, we are starting to find some strains of the Staganospora fungus that are resistant to strobilurin fungicides. So we may start to see that strobilurin fungicides may not be as effective as they used to be in managing at least Staganospora. Stripe rust, I found stripe rust yesterday in Princeton. I know that there was a report out of Southern Illinois recently as well, and I think there's, on Twitter, it looks like there's a little bit of stripe rust in southeast Missouri as well. So that's a disease that's not uncommon for our area. The temperature has been perfect for stripe rust. Cool and wet is really what this likes. Once it warms up later this week, it'll probably kind of make the stripe rust fizzle out. But it's probably come in too late this year to really cause much yield loss. I think 2016 was a year that we did see stripe rust causing some yield loss in southern Illinois and western Kentucky, mostly because of planting a couple of very susceptible varieties. But I think for this year, even though we're seeing it, probably going to be coming in too late, as most of our wheat is really post-flowering at this point in time, and it's going to warm up and probably not going to see a whole lot of damage from stripe rust this year. Fungicides are very effective. Even those that you apply later on for scab protection are still going to provide some protection against stripe rust. And here's just a couple of pictures of stripe rust. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but you can see the orange pustules that are there on the leaf. And obviously this is called stripe rust because of the pattern that those pustules are on the leaf in those kind of linear fashion. So you may run into that as you're out looking at some of your fields, maybe looking for freeze damage. You may see a little bit of stripe rust that's out there. And of course, the big one, Fusarium head blight. This is the one that probably our biggest concern in the state, just because of the type of losses it can cause. And of course, it does cause yield losses, but the biggest losses are due to quality losses, lower test weight, but especially the contamination of the mycotoxin that this fungus produces, called deoxynivalenol or DON, D-O-N. Some people call it vomitoxin as well. So those are the two biggest concerns with this disease, are those quality issues. Conditions have been fairly favorable for infection by the scab fungus since wheat has been headed out. And of course, wheat only starts to become susceptible when it begins to flower. When you start to see those anthers coming out of that head, that's when that head becomes susceptible to infection by the scab fungus. And it continues to be susceptible to infection through soft dough or so. So even though we're past flowering right now, we're still at a susceptible stage of getting infection. Now, the earlier the infection occurs, the more likely you're going to have some bigger problems with test weight and higher DON levels. Now, the caveat here is we've had some cool temperatures, and so that may reduce some of the risk. The optimum temperature for the scab fungus starts around about 70 degrees, 75 degrees or so would be kind of optimum for this fungus. So, we have been below that, especially at nighttime. So that may help reduce some of the risks that's out there. I've noticed as I've looked at some of my plots over the last few days that I do have some freeze injury, not maybe necessarily from Saturday morning that just happened, but from about whenever that was, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, when we had that freeze that occurred in April. And that did cause, it did affect some of the heads, and I've got bleached heads that have emerged, and it looks a little bit like scab. So one of the things that you're going to have to pay attention to is being able to distinguish between freeze injury and scab this year. Just some pictures of scab. I know you're all familiar with what scab looks like, but one of the things that may help you differentiate between the freeze injury and the scab symptoms would be what you're seeing here on the left. You can see that sort of an orange discoloration there in between the glumes. Those are actually a mass of spores of the scab fungus that you can see with the naked eye even. So, you know, if you're seeing that, then obviously that's scab. And over on the right, you can see some of the sort of kind of a light pink hue that these heads tend to have that are affected by scab. And you're going to see more of that with the scab symptoms versus injury from the freeze damage. The other thing I've noticed, at least from damage from the freeze that occurred 3 or 4 weeks ago, is that you know, those heads don't have any kernels in them. Those aren't plump at all. So that would be the other difference that you might see is, you know, even though this head's still affected by scab, there are kernels in there. Whereas the heads that I'm seeing that are bleached, that were emerged bleached, there won't be any kernels that develop in there. I know Dr. Knott's going to probably talk a lot more about this, so I won't continue to talk about that. Just to show you some of the risk, there is the risk map that's available at this website, wheatscab.psu.edu. And that site looks a little bit different this year. If you've been to it, it looks a little bit different. They're still kind of updating. They've changed the site. They're updating it still, but it's in a usable place right now. So what you're seeing here at the bottom is a map that I took a screenshot of last night, and then a week ago, and then 2 weeks ago. And you can see that with the red and the yellow is a medium risk, red is high risk, that there has been pretty good risk for a big part of Kentucky over the last couple of weeks. So I think if you did spray a fungicide to help protect against scab, in regards to scab management, I think that was a good idea based on the risk that we're seeing. Of course, with scab, the important things are to start off with a good management plan, and that is to plant the most resistant varieties available. There are a lot of choices of varieties that are out there, but choosing the ones that are most resistant would be the way to go. Dave Van Sanford and Bill Bruning do some ratings for scab. Dave has as he'll talk about, I'm sure, has a scab nursery in which he gets a pretty good level of disease and is able to make some really good ratings. And all that information is available if you go to the small grains variety testing website. And so that's a good place to start when you're looking for resistant varieties. And then finally, fungicides are the other key to this, and spraying at the right timing is important. We've got some different choices there. Carumba, Miravis Ace, and Fusarium all seem to be the most effective in managing this disease. And just to show you one quick data slide here, this is looking at control of DON, the vomitoxin in harvested grain from trials I've conducted here in Princeton from 2016 to 2019. In this case, the higher the bar, the better level of control that we got of DON. So this is all relative to our untreated check. And you can see we had Miravis Ace applied at Feeks 10.3 and then applied at Feeks 10.5.1, Fusarium at 10.5.1, and Carumba at 10.5.1. And what we're finding is if you apply any of these fungicides at 10.5.1, they seem to give a pretty similar level of protection against scab as well as DON as what you're seeing here. And anything with the same letter above it means that statistically they were similar. So we have several fungicide choices that are out there now, and they all seem to be relatively similar in their control of DON. That's good. And more choices that we have for fungicides, I think that's better. Finally, I just wanted to thank Kentucky Small Grain Growers Association, and we also get funding through the USDA ARS U.S. Wheat and Barley Scab Initiative, which helps us put together a lot of these trials. And then we also get support from some of our industry friends as well, who help support some of the fungicide trials, help provide varieties, chemicals, things like that really help us. So with that, I'd be happy to try to answer any questions.
Cool.
Chad, do you see any questions for me?
I don't see anything that's come in yet. I was looking for them. Now's the time, folks, to.
Carl, this is Carrie. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
There is
okay?
one question that was sent to me privately, but go ahead, Carrie.
You can
and
answer
then I'll
that
get to
first if you want.
Okay, so there is a question about how do you determine risk? So that's probably in regards to that risk map that's on there. Those are some models that were developed and continue to be improved and continue to be developed by some researchers that are located at Kansas State University, Ohio State University, and Penn State University. And a lot of that's based on weather. It uses relative humidity, temperature, and rainfall, and it's able to determine the risk that way. Of course, the risk is only valid if you are at a susceptible stage in your wheat. So you can check the site at just about any time, but if your wheat's not yet flowering or not yet headed out, then that risk doesn't really apply to your wheat until it's actually at that susceptible stage. Go ahead, Carrie.
Yeah, so I've gotten several calls since the past weekend, of course, right, over the wheat freeze. I'm curious, they're wanting to know, should they spray head scab fungicides? And if most of this is coming from the central part of the state where they had a killing frost probably that would have killed the anthers. And so I'm not sure I know what to tell them. I'm curious what you would tell them.
Well, let me add into that, Carl, if I can. So I know one particular field where it was at 29 degrees for 5 hours, according to the Mesonet. At least that's the closest station to that field. And they said about 10% of their heads were pollinating at that point. So do they target those heads, or do they assume those heads are gone and try to target the next wave? Is that about what you're asking too, Carrie?
Yeah, but I mean, the fields that I'm getting calls about were full fields at 1051. So
Okay.
They're very curious about survival. And then, of course, should they be investing in head scab if those anthers are dead?
Okay. I don't have a perfect answer, but I'll lay out the facts a little bit, I guess. So if those heads are not going to be filling with grain, then there's no use spending a fungicide on them, okay? Fungicide's not going to reduce any of the freeze injury. It's not going to have any effect on what happened because of freeze injury. The risk of scab does not go up because of freeze injury either. So the risk of the disease doesn't necessarily go up. So the question is really more about, am I going to have grain out here to protect or not? And so that's where I would probably rely maybe more on the agronomists to help out answer that question, is if, passing the buck here a little bit, are those heads going to make it or not? What's the risk? What's the likelihood of those heads being able to produce grain after spending 2 to 3 hours at below freezing temperatures? And if the likelihood is low of those heads going on and being able to produce grain, then I would not spend the money on the fungicide, because you're not going to get anything back from it at that point in time. If there's not any grain to protect, you're not going to get your money back on the fungicide. So I know that wasn't a black and white answer, but I guess I laid out the facts, and that's the way I would look at it on a field-to-field basis.
All right, Carl, I am going to bring up the poll, and while I'm bringing up the poll, if you want to answer the private one that came to you, feel free to do that as well. And for everybody else, I'm going to try to get to the next poll on this. So let's see, how do I do that? I'll mess with that, and Carl, you do what you need to do, okay?
Sure. There was a question about test weight. What do we see about yield and test weight? Of course, I didn't show all my slides on, this is in regards to fungicides. And some more questions in there about leaf diseases with some of the different fungicides. In regards to control of leaf diseases, with all those fungicides I showed at that head scab timing, They all provide similar levels of leaf disease control for most of my trials. We have seen a little bit of a consistent bump in test weight, I would say, with Mirvis Ace versus our other 2 fungicides that I showed in there over those 8 environments of data. So we do see a little bit of difference in that. Of course, those are things that you need to be checking in your own field and things like that. But from a disease control perspective, the fungicides do seem to be pretty similar. Looks like that pretty much covers the questions that I see that came in.